Hey there, fellow insomniacs and highway warriors. Welcome back to another episode of ridiculously specific historical facts that'll make you grateful for your boring modern life. I am your chronically sleep-deprived host, and today we're diving into why being a pharaoh was basically the world's first nightmare job with a really good PR team. Drop a comment and let me know if you're listening while stuck in traffic, pulling an all-nighter, or just trying to distract yourself from whatever existential crisis brought you here at this ungodly hour. I love hearing about all the creative ways we're avoiding our responsibilities together. So picture this. Everyone thinks being a pharaoh meant unlimited power, golden toilets, and the ancient equivalent of a private jet. Oh, honey, bless your naive little heart. Being pharaoh was less living like a god and more being held personally responsible for literally everything that went wrong in the universe. Think your boss micromanages you. Try having an entire civilization expect you to personally make sure the sun rises tomorrow morning. Let's start with the pharaoh's morning routine, which makes your worst Monday look like a spa day. These poor souls couldn't just roll out of bed and grab coffee like normal humans. Oh no. Every single morning began with what I can only describe as the world's most stressful costume change. Picture waking up and immediately being swarmed by a dozen servants who had to ritually wash every inch of your body. Not because you were dirty, but because apparently regular human skin wasn't divine enough for public consumption. The dressing ceremony alone took hours. Hours! We're talking about grown adults whose entire job was to debate which sacred amulet went where, while the pharaoh stood there like the world's most awkward mannequin. They had to apply makeup that contained more lead than a medieval paint factory, strap on a fake beard that looked like it belonged in a community theatre production of Moses the Musical, and balance a crown on their head that weighed about as much as a toddler, all before breakfast. And speaking of breakfast, try eating cornflakes when everyone around you is convinced that your chewing technique directly affects whether the Nile will flood properly this year. The pressure was so intense that pharaohs probably developed stomach ulcers just from the stress of deciding between wheat bread and barley porridge. But here's where it gets really fun. The ancient Egyptians had this concept called Ma'at, which was basically cosmic order and balance. Sounds peaceful, right? Wrong. The pharaoh was personally responsible for maintaining this balance, not just in Egypt, in the entire universe. Imagine being blamed every time it rains too much, doesn't rain enough, or rains exactly the right amount but on the wrong Tuesday. These poor guys were essentially divine customer service representatives for the entire cosmos. Drought, Pharaoh's fault. Flood, also Pharaoh's fault. Locust decided to have a block party in your wheat fields? Guess who's getting the angry phone calls from every farmer in the kingdom? The daily religious ceremonies were enough to drive anyone to madness. While regular people got to complain about their jobs over beer, pharaohs had to spend hours each day performing elaborate rituals that looked like they were choreographed by someone who'd never heard of efficiency. They had to feed statues of gods elaborate meals, and I mean elaborate. We're talking full 7-course dinners served to chunks of carved stone that had about the same conversational skills as your average rock. Picture this. You're standing in a temple that smells like incense mixed with whatever died in the corner last week, holding a golden spoon, trying to feed soup to a statue of a falcon-headed god who's giving you the same judgmental stare as your mother-in-law at Thanksgiving dinner. Meanwhile, actual people outside are probably eating bread that tastes like disappointment and has the nutritional value of cardboard. Modern CEOs complain about board meetings, but at least their colleagues are human beings who occasionally blink. Pharaohs had to conduct serious policy discussions with deities who communicated through, well, absolutely nothing. Imagine trying to get consensus from a committee where half the members are statues and the other half are priests who speak exclusively in riddles that sound like they were translated through Google Translate 5 times. And here's the real kicker. The thing that would drive any normal person completely insane. Pharaohs couldn't have bad days. Think about that for a second. You know, that feeling when you wake up and everything's wrong? Your coffee tastes like sadness, your hair looks like you stuck your finger in an electrical socket, and you'd rather crawl back under the covers and pretend civilization was a mistake. Well, if you're Pharaoh and you're having one of those days, congratulations, you've just threatened the stability of the entire known world. Because here's what nobody tells you about absolute power. It's absolutely exhausting. Every facial expression was analysed for political significance. Every sneeze could start a diplomatic incident. God forbid you showed up to a ceremony looking like you'd rather be literally anywhere else, because suddenly every priest, advisor, and random person within a 50-mile radius would start panicking that the gods were angry and the end times were upon us. You couldn't even scratch an itch without someone writing it down in hieroglyphics for future generations to analyse. In the 3rd year of his reign, the divine Pharaoh did scratch his nose with great vigour, surely a sign that the harvest would be bountiful. I'm not making this up. Well, okay, I'm making up that specific example, but you get the idea. The Pharaoh's bathroom breaks probably required a committee meeting to plan. Picture having to maintain your divine composure while desperately needing to pee, knowing that 17 different officials are watching your every move to make sure you're still sufficiently godlike while handling basic human biology. There's probably some ancient papyrus scroll somewhere detailing the proper royal technique for divine urination. So while everyone assumes that absolute power means absolute freedom, pharaohs were actually prisoners of their own divine status. They were trapped in a golden cage made of religious obligations, political expectations, and the constant terror of disappointing literally everyone they'd ever met. They couldn't take a vacation, couldn't call in sick, and definitely couldn't announce they were having an existential crisis and needed to find themselves through interpretive dance or whatever. But if you think the constant pressure of cosmic responsibility was bad, wait until you hear about their complete and utter lack of privacy. Because when you're supposedly divine, apparently that means every moment of your existence becomes public property, and your personal life turns into the world's first, most invasive reality show. So, you think modern influencers have no privacy? Oh, sweetie. Let me tell you about the original reality TV stars who made the Kardashians look like hermits living in caves. Pharaohs didn't just have their lives documented. They had their lives supervised, analysed, and turned into a 24/7 performance that would make Big Brother look like a relaxing meditation retreat. Let's start with something as basic as sleep, because apparently even unconsciousness wasn't private when you were supposedly divine. Picture this. You're trying to get some rest after a long day of cosmic responsibility and divine customer service, but instead of counting sheep, you're counting the number of servants who are literally watching you sleep. Not guarding you while you sleep, watching you sleep. Their entire job was to make sure you were still breathing, and more importantly, still sufficiently godlike while drooling on your golden pillow. These weren't just any servants either. We're talking about professional sleepwatchers whose career advancement depended on their ability to detect whether the pharaoh's snoring patterns indicated divine contentment or cosmic displeasure. Imagine trying to have a peaceful dream about literally anything normal, while knowing that tomorrow morning someone's going to file a report about how your sleep-talking sounded like the voice of Ra himself, or worse, like you were having very human nightmares about forgetting to feed the falcon statue its morning soup. And if you think that's invasive, wait until you hear about the bathroom situation. You know how you treasure those few minutes of privacy in the bathroom, scrolling through your phone and wondering what's stuck under your toenail, probably because you haven't trimmed it in a month. Well, pharaohs had servants whose entire professional identity revolved around observing their bowel movements. I'm not making this up. There were literally people whose job title was essentially Royal Defecation Analyst. Their daily responsibilities included monitoring the divine digestive process, because apparently even pharaonic poop had religious significance. These poor souls had to determine whether the royal stool indicated that the gods were pleased or if the kingdom was about to face 7 years of agricultural disaster based on fiber content and consistency. Picture having to maintain your divine composure while someone with a scroll and a very serious expression takes detailed notes about your bathroom habits. Day 12 of the 3rd month. His Divine Majesty's morning constitutional appeared robust and well-formed, suggesting the harvest will be bountiful. Also noted, slight straining, possibly indicating minor diplomatic tensions with Nubia. Then there were the professional food tasters, because pharaohs couldn't even enjoy a meal without it becoming a life-or-death performance. But these weren't just people checking for poison. Oh no, that would be too simple. These were individuals who had to taste the food and then provide detailed analysis of how each bite reflected the pharaoh's divine status and what it meant for Egypt's future. Every food choice was a political statement. Want some bread? Well, that bread better align with the proper religious calendar, or you'll have priests explaining to everyone why your carbohydrate preferences have angered the gods. Feeling like fish? Hope you picked the right fish, because apparently choosing between Nile perch and catfish could determine whether the annual flood would be adequate for crops. And the ceremonial foods. Dear gods, the ceremonial foods. Pharaohs often had to eat things that had all the flavour and appeal of communion wafers made from sawdust and regret, but they had to eat them with the enthusiasm of someone discovering chocolate for the first time, because showing any sign that the sacred meal tasted like it was prepared by someone who learned cooking from a badly translated cookbook would undermine the entire divine dining experience. Think your work meetings are awkward? Try having conversations where everyone has to prostrate themselves face down on the floor. Imagine trying to conduct important business when your advisors look like they're doing the world's most respectful planking exercise. You're trying to discuss trade agreements with Syria while everyone you're talking to has their nose pressed to the ground like they're searching for a lost contact lens. So, about those grain shipments, you'd say, looking down at a collection of prone figures who can't even make eye contact, because apparently your divine face would blind them like staring directly at the sun. How do you read body language when the only body parts visible are the backs of people's heads? How do you tell if someone disagrees with your policy when they're not allowed to do anything but murmur agreement into the floor tiles? The palace etiquette was so bizarre that normal human interaction became impossible. Pharaohs were essentially living statues that occasionally moved and spoke, surrounded by people who had to pretend that everything they said was profound wisdom from the gods, even when they were probably just asking someone to pass the salt or complaining about a headache. But wait, it gets worse. Pharaohs were walking tourist attractions for visiting dignitaries. Foreign ambassadors would show up expecting a divine performance, and the pharaoh had to deliver on command. Oh, you're from Mesopotamia. Let me just whip up a quick miracle for your entertainment. Would you prefer water turning into wine, or should I make the sacred crocodile dance? No pressure, but your trade agreement depends on how impressed you are by my godlike abilities. These poor rulers had to perform divinity like street magicians, except instead of tips, they were hoping for political alliances and trying to avoid international incidents. Imagine being expected to prove your divine status to every skeptical foreign leader who shows up thinking, "Okay, impress me, golden boy. Show me why I should take you seriously and not just conquer your kingdom next Tuesday." Modern influencers complain about having to pose for photos and maintain their image online, but at least they can turn off their phones occasionally. Pharaohs couldn't even pick their nose without 3 scribes documenting it for historical records. There's probably some papyrus scroll in a museum right now that reads, "In the 5th year of his reign, the god king did excavate his left nostril with divine precision. surely a sign that the gods favor our mining operations. You know that feeling when you realize you've been walking around all day with spinach in your teeth and nobody told you. Well, pharaohs lived with the constant terror that they might be having a very human moment while everyone around them was too terrified to point it out. They could have had their fake beard on backwards, their crown sliding off their head, and a piece of sacred bread stuck between their teeth, but everyone would just nod solemnly and declare it the height of divine fashion. The psychological pressure of constant performance was enough to drive anyone completely insane. Every facial expression was analysed. Every gesture was interpreted as either a divine blessing or a cosmic warning. Pharaohs couldn't even have private thoughts, because someone was always watching, always judging, always ready to turn their most human moments into religious significance or political implications. But if you think living under constant surveillance was stressful, imagine how much worse it got when the people watching you weren't just taking notes. They were actively plotting to murder you. Because you might think the worst part about being constantly watched was the lack of privacy. Honey, that's an innocent way of looking at it. The worst part was discovering that all those people watching you weren't just taking notes for posterity. They were taking notes to figure out the best way to murder you without getting caught. Welcome to the world of pharaonic office politics, where hostile work environment meant your co-workers were literally planning your assassination during lunch breaks. And I'm not talking about the occasional disgruntled employee who leaves passive-aggressive notes in the break room refrigerator. We're talking about systematic, organised, family-approved murder plots that would make a mafia boss proud. Let's start with some cheerful statistics that'll make you appreciate your boring desk job. Roughly 1 in 3 pharaohs died violent deaths. Not from accidents, not from natural causes, from other people actively trying to kill them. That's a worse survival rate than being a medieval plague doctor, and those guys literally walked around poking diseased people with sticks. Take Ramesses III, who had to deal with what historians politely call the harem conspiracy, which sounds like a trashy reality TV show, but was actually a coordinated assassination plot involving his own wives, his court officials, and probably the guy who delivered his morning papyrus. His beloved wife Ta decided she was tired of waiting for natural succession and thought, you know what, let's just speed up this whole process with some good old-fashioned murder. Picture this. You're Ramesses III, trying to enjoy a quiet evening at home, maybe catching up on some light reading about military campaigns or divine livestock management, when you realize that your wife, your advisors, and half your household staff are plotting to kill you. It's like discovering that your family group chat has been secretly planning your demise while you've been sending them funny memes about cats. The conspiracy involved forging letters, bribing officials, and even practicing magic spells, because apparently murdering a pharaoh required both political cunning and supernatural backup. They literally tried to kill him with bureaucracy and witchcraft simultaneously. It's like if your office tried to eliminate you through both a hostile takeover and voodoo dolls made from your coffee cup. And here's the kicker. Ramesses III survived the initial assassination attempt, but died shortly after from throat wounds that suggest someone eventually got close enough to finish the job. So not only did he have to live with the knowledge that his own family wanted him dead, he also had to deal with the constant paranoia that they were probably going to try again. This wasn't an isolated incident. Pharaohs routinely had to employ food tasters, not just for poison, but because someone had to risk their life to make sure the royal breakfast wasn't laced with whatever creative toxins the kitchen staff had cooked up that morning. Imagine having to wait for someone else to eat your cereal first, just to make sure it wasn't going to kill you before you could finish your morning divine obligations. They slept in different rooms each night, like the world's most paranoid game of musical chairs. Except instead of losing a seat, you lost your life if you picked the wrong bedroom. Pharaohs had to live like they were playing an eternal game of hide-and-seek, where being found meant being murdered by someone who was supposed to be on your payroll. Modern corporate paranoia has nothing on pharaonic workplace dynamics. You think your boss is out to get you. Try having actual children who were raised from birth to view you as either a stepping stone to power or an obstacle to eliminate. Succession planning in ancient Egypt often involved literal murder, which makes modern corporate ladder climbing look like a friendly game of Candyland. Your own sons were potential assassins. Your brothers were plotting coups. Your wives were comparing notes on the most efficient ways to poison your wine. Family dinners must have been absolutely delightful. Pass the bread, dear. And by the way, are you still planning to have me killed next Tuesday? Or should I clear my schedule for Wednesday instead? The priests were another constant threat, because they controlled public opinion and could turn the entire population against you if they decided you weren't being sufficiently religious. Imagine having to maintain perfect divine behavior while knowing that one religious misstep could result in the entire priesthood declaring you unfit to rule and encouraging a popular uprising. It's like having to impress your most judgmental relatives while they're actively looking for reasons to disinherit you. Foreign diplomacy was equally terrifying. Every visiting ambassador was potentially scouting for weaknesses. Every trade negotiation was a test of Egypt's military strength. And every diplomatic dinner was an opportunity for someone to slip something deadly into your ceremonial wine. You had to be charming, powerful and divine while simultaneously watching for signs that your dinner guests were planning to invade your kingdom the moment they got home. The military generals were perhaps the scariest threat of all because they commanded actual armies and could overthrow you with organized force rather than sneaky palace intrigue. Pharaohs had to maintain the loyalty of people who were professionally trained to kill efficiently and had thousands of soldiers at their disposal. It's like being a CEO where all your department heads are trained assassins with their own private armies. You know that feeling when you're at work and you can't tell if your coworkers actually like you or if they're just being polite. Pharaohs lived with that anxiety cranked up to 11, except instead of wondering if people were talking about them behind their backs, they were wondering if people were literally sharpening knives behind their backs. The paranoia must have been absolutely exhausting. Every smile was potentially fake. Every gesture of loyalty was possibly a setup. Every person who approached you could be carrying a concealed weapon or a vial of poison that smelled like the tears of your enemies and tasted like the last regret you'd ever have. Even the servants who helped them dress each morning could have been bribed or coerced into participating in assassination plots. Imagine having to trust someone to help you put on your elaborate royal outfit while wondering if they'd been paid to strangle you with your own ceremonial necklace. The fake beard alone had enough straps and attachments to make an excellent murder weapon in the right hands. Pharaohs developed elaborate security protocols that would make modern Secret Service agents weep with appreciation. They had decoy food, decoy sleeping arrangements, and probably decoy conversations to throw off potential assassins. Their lives became elaborate performances, not just for divine purposes, but for basic survival. But here's the truly horrifying part. Even if they managed to survive all the assassination attempts, the political intrigue, and the constant threat of violent death, the job itself was slowly killing them in ways that were somehow even worse than outright murder. So you're thinking that even with all the assassination attempts and divine micromanagement, at least pharaohs got to enjoy the good life, right? Oh dear, let me tell you about the exquisite ways that luxury tried to murder them on a daily basis. Picture this. You wake up as Pharaoh Khufu, and before you can even contemplate whether the sun is going to cooperate with your God schedule today, your beauty team arrives. And when I say beauty team, I mean a small army of servants carrying what looks like a medieval torture kit disguised as cosmetics. They're about to slather your face with makeup that contains more lead than a Roman water pipe and enough mercury to make a thermometer jealous. Now you might think, well, at least they looked fabulous while slowly poisoning themselves. Think again, Buttercup. These weren't Instagram-worthy makeup tutorials. This was more like watching someone apply paint primer to their face, except the primer was designed by someone who clearly had a grudge against human skin, the kohl around their eyes, made with galena, which is basically lead sulfide. Imagine putting on eyeliner that's actively giving you brain damage while you're trying to look divine. And speaking of looking divine, let's talk about those iconic Pharaoh headdresses. You know, the ones that look so majestic in movies. Those things weighed about as much as a small child and had the ergonomic design of a medieval torture device. Pharaohs spent their entire reign with chronic neck problems that would make a modern office worker weep with sympathy. Picture trying to maintain your godlike composure while your cervical spine is screaming louder than a cat stuck in a washing machine. But wait, there's more. The royal body paint situation was like a walking chemistry experiment gone wrong. They'd cover themselves in substances that would make a hazmat team nervous, all in the name of looking appropriately divine. Some of these paints contained arsenic, because apparently the lead wasn't doing its job fast enough. It's like they looked at every toxic element on the periodic table and thought, yes, this belongs on my face. Now, you poor deluded child, you might be thinking that at least they had amazing food to compensate for the cosmetic poisoning. The royal diet was about as nutritionally sound as a toddler's Halloween candy binge. Pharaohs were expected to eat ceremonial foods that had all the nutritional value of cardboard soaked in pyramid dust. They'd feast on elaborate dishes that looked impressive, but were essentially expensive ways to develop scurvy. The bread they ate was made from grain that was often contaminated with sand particles, because ancient milling techniques were apparently designed by someone who really enjoyed dental problems. Imagine every meal being like chewing on a sandwich that someone accidentally dropped at the beach. Their teeth wore down faster than car tires in a demolition derby, and dental hygiene consisted of prayers to gods who were probably too busy laughing to help. But here's where it gets really special. The family tree situation. Oh, sweetie, let me tell you about royal inbreeding, because pharaohs took keeping it in the family to levels that would make a soap opera writer say, that's too weird even for us. Pharaohs were expected to marry their sisters to keep the bloodline pure, which is like saying you're going to maintain your car by only using parts from the same broken-down vehicle. The genetic consequences were about as predictable as you'd expect. Poor Tutankhamun ended up with a clubfoot, a cleft palate, and probably felt like he was assembled from spare parts that didn't quite fit together. His family tree looked less like a tree and more like a telephone pole with a few confused branches. The medical treatments they received were like watching a medieval episode of Jackass, except nobody was laughing. Royal physicians would prescribe remedies that included crocodile dung, because apparently someone looked at crocodile poop and thought, this seems medicinal. They'd mix it with honey and various herbs, creating what was essentially a gourmet turd sandwich for treating everything from headaches to broken bones. You know that feeling when you're sick and you'll try anything to feel better? Well, pharaohs had doctors who took that desperation and ran with it straight into the realm of biological warfare. They'd prescribe treatments involving mouse droppings, decayed meat, and substances that would make a garbage disposal gag. The cure was often worse than the disease, assuming you survived long enough to find out which was which. And let's not forget the stress-induced health problems. Being constantly divine is exhausting work. Pharaohs developed what we'd now recognize as severe anxiety disorders, but back then, admitting you were having a mental health crisis was like admitting you weren't actually a god. So they'd just internalize all that pressure until their bodies started falling apart like a cheap umbrella in a hurricane. The royal lifestyle was basically a slow-motion suicide wrapped in gold and ceremony. They lived in palaces that were more like luxurious prisons, surrounded by luxury that was actively trying to kill them, eating food that was slowly poisoning them, and married to relatives who shared their genetic weaknesses like a family recipe nobody wanted. But here's the truly twisted part. Even when all this luxury and privilege finally did them in, their problems were just getting started. Because death, as it turns out, was just the beginning of a pharaoh's really bad day. The afterlife had its own special brand of workplace harassment waiting for them, complete with job responsibilities that made their earthly duties look like a relaxing vacation. So you might be thinking that at least when pharaohs finally died, they got to rest in peace, right? Oh, bless your naive heart. Death was just the beginning of the worst performance review in human history. Here's the thing about being a pharaoh: retirement was not in the job description. These poor souls were expected to continue their divine duties in the afterlife, which is like being told your unpaid overtime extends into eternity. The ancient Egyptians literally believed that dead pharaohs were still responsible for making sure Egypt didn't fall apart, because apparently even death couldn't get you out of middle management. Picture this: you're finally dead, thinking you can escape the constant pressure of being a living god, and then you realize your KR, that's your soul, for those keeping track, is still clocked in for the night shift. Egyptian theology basically turned the afterlife into the ultimate work-from-home situation, except home is a tomb, and your commute involves navigating the underworld while still maintaining Egypt's cosmic stability. But before we get to the eternal labor violations, let's talk about the delightful process of actually dying as a pharaoh. The mummification process was like being prepared for the world's most expensive and traumatic spa treatment. First, they'd pull your brain out through your nose with what looked like a medieval crochet hook, because apparently the ancient Egyptians thought brains were about as useful as expired yogurt. You know that feeling when you're getting dental work done and the tools sound like they're mining for gold in your molars? Well, imagine that, but they're fishing around in your skull cavity like they're trying to unclog a drain. The embalmers would scoop out your brain matter with the same enthusiasm as someone cleaning out a pumpkin, except the pumpkin used to be your thoughts and personality. Then came the organ removal party, where they'd make incisions that looked like they were planned by someone who learned anatomy from a butcher's manual. They'd remove your liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines, storing them in fancy jars like the world's most morbid Tupperware collection. Your heart got to stay, because the Egyptians believed it was the center of intelligence, which explains a lot about ancient decision-making processes. After that, they'd stuff your body with natron salt for 40 days, essentially turning you into the world's most expensive piece of jerky. The whole process was so traumatic that the embalmers themselves had to undergo ritual purification afterward, because apparently handling dead pharaohs was considered spiritually contaminating. It's like being so toxic at work that even touching your paperwork requires hazmat protocols. Now, here's where it gets really special. While you're being processed like a luxury mummy, your tomb, the one you spent your entire life and the entire Egyptian treasury building, is already being cased by professional grave robbers. These weren't amateur hour thieves. These were organized crime syndicates with better planning skills than most modern heist movies. The tomb robbers had the architectural blueprints, inside information from construction workers, and the patience of people who really understood the value of delayed gratification. They'd wait just long enough for the funeral procession to leave, then show up with tools that looked like they were borrowed from a medieval torture chamber and get to work like they were moving apartments, except the apartment was your eternal resting place, and the furniture was your priceless burial goods. Picture spending decades building the most elaborate security system in human history, complete with false chambers, deadly traps, and curses that would make a horror movie writer weep with envy, only to have it defeated by what were essentially ancient cat burglars with really good timing. It's like installing a state-of-the-art home security system and then having it bypassed by someone who really needs your flat-screen TV. The really twisted part is that many pharaohs' tombs were recycled for later rulers, because even in death, real estate was apparently a competitive market. Imagine finally dying, getting your eternal rest all set up, and then having some future pharaoh show up, like, "Thanks for the tomb, but I'm going to need you to relocate to the storage unit down the hall." It's like being evicted from your own grave. But wait, there's more. Fast forward a few thousand years, and your mummy becomes a tourist attraction. Victorian-era Europeans would literally unwrap mummies at dinner parties, because apparently nothing says sophisticated entertainment like desecrating ancient corpses while eating finger sandwiches. Your body, which was supposed to be preserved for eternity, becomes the main course at what was essentially a really morbid potluck. Modern archaeology has turned pharaohs into science experiments that would make a lab rat file a complaint with HR. They're getting CT scans, DNA tests, and chemical analyses that reveal everything from their diet to their dental problems to their family dysfunction. Poor Tutankhamun has been studied more thoroughly than most people study for their SATs, and the results are about as flattering as a driver's license photo. Scientists can now tell you that Ramesses II had arthritis, dental abscesses, and hardened arteries, which is like having your medical records published in National Geographic 3,000 years after you specifically requested privacy. They've determined that some pharaohs died from infected wisdom teeth, which means the most powerful people in the ancient world were taken down by dental problems that a modern teenager could solve with a trip to the orthodontist. The ultimate irony is that pharaohs achieved immortality, just not the kind they were shooting for. They're remembered not as the divine beings they pretended to be, but as cautionary tales about the absurdity of absolute power and the human cost of playing God. They wanted to be worshipped for eternity, and instead they became museum exhibits that school children giggle at during field trips. So there you have it. Being a pharaoh was basically signing up for the worst job in human history, with no possibility of retirement, a work environment that was actively trying to kill you, and a death that was just the beginning of a really long, really public performance review. They traded their humanity for divinity and ended up with neither. And that, my sleep-deprived night owls, is why you should maybe reconsider your complaints about your current job. At least your boss can't blame you for droughts, your co-workers probably aren't plotting your assassination, and your retirement plan doesn't involve having your brain pulled out through your nose. Sweet dreams, safe travels, and remember to hit that subscribe button if you enjoyed this journey through the worst career choice in human history. Until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood insomniac historian, reminding you that sometimes the best way to appreciate your life is to learn about someone else's spectacularly terrible one.